All right, welcome everyone. This is Modex Japan webinar. My name is Ryan Smith. I'm a professor at Washington State University in Pullman, Washington. And my partner in business and also in research is Ivan Rupnik. Ivan, like to introduce yourself?
Hi, Ryan. I'm Ivan Rupnik, long-term collaborator of this man over on the other screen, architect and researcher, and a tough lover of offsite construction.
Yeah, and that is what Modex is tough love for the offsite industrialized construction sector. We try to take academic research and turn it into something that can really support industry and move it forward. In particular, there are a few things that we do. One is knowledge management and knowledge exchange. We encourage the industry to share with one another in so much as we can and are able to, in order to propel offsite and industrialized construction, a more productive method of delivery. But we're also critical of that, and we want to dig down deep with companies to try to uncover the problems and continuously improve individual businesses and the sector at large. Modex also runs a number of tours and knowledge exchange trips. That has subsided since COVID, and we'll talk a little bit about our next one to Japan we hope to take soon, as well as Scotland and Sweden and other locations around the world. In the interim, we've been doing virtual exchanges. So you can go to our website at modex.network, modx.network, and find more opportunities like this that we have recorded. Most of them are pre-recorded video casts, and we will continue to do live webinars like this. This is live, so you can ask your questions on this venue. If you go down to the bottom, if you are familiar with Zoom, if not, it's pretty simple. There's a Q&A button. It has a bunch of two clouds next to each other, says Q&A. You can type in questions on that question and answer, and we will try to answer it during this venue. If not, we'll answer it and then send it out to the group after this is over. This will be recorded, so you are being recorded. I have to let you know that, you know, if you're putting in questions and we're trying to answer, but your faces aren't on there, so I'm not too worried about any privacy issues. Why Japan? Why are we talking about Japan today? Ivan and I have been to Japan a few times and have developed strong relationships with a professor there, Suichi Matsumura. He's at the University of Tokyo, and he did a one-on-one interview, what we call our Modex Network Voices. If you go to our website, he has done an interview there, and you can learn more about the history of Japan. Today, we're going to be talking about more contemporary practice and what is going on in Japan currently, with regards to modular construction. But also, we've developed a strong relationship with Sekisui Heim, Sekisui Chemical, who's the largest modular producer in Japan, and they have been very generous with sharing information with us over the years, and we wanted to convey that information to a broader audience, particularly an English-speaking audience that may not get the opportunity to go to Japan and see these factories. You're going to see them today in photos, and we're going to share as much as we can. And we thank our partners, Professor Matsumura and Sekisui Chemical, for their participation in this and giving us information. With that, we're going to go to the second slide. This is the agenda for today. I just did an introduction. Ivan Rupnik will do a 10 to 15 minute overview. It may take longer than that, actually. And he will be talking about the context of our discussion. And then we'll have a Q&A session with the audience after that. So again, you can type in your questions on the Q&A button at the bottom of the menu for Zoom. We'll try to answer them. And then I'll conclude by talking about our next trip to Japan, which you're all invited to come to and participate in. So at that point, at this point, I think we're going to turn the time to Ivan, who will run through some slides and explain what research we have gathered over the last few years regarding Japanese modular construction. Go ahead, Ivan.
Thanks, Ryan. Thanks, everyone, for joining today virtually. Hopefully, we'll all be in Japan soon and other exotic locales. So again, as a way to link back to Professor Matsumura's excellent analysis into the kind of past and present of the offsite industry, we wanted to touch on the Japanese context. When we research any company or program, we think that context is the key step to understanding and preparing for knowledge transfer. We don't understand the kind of factors. We can't understand how different or how similar these things are. So we've been surprised again at how Japan in many ways shares similar history and even some overlaps in terms of policy and technology, and yet has very different results in their offsite sector. So Japan, for example, light-gauge steel is the dominant material used or system used in construction, particularly in offsite construction, actually in offsite construction. Its largest company in offsite, Sekisui House, has been around since 1960. In 1962, there was a kind of 5 and 5 for those of you for US audience know this initiative in the US. There was in 1962, there was a goal to grow market share for offsite construction to 15% from 0 to 1970. 64, there was an association formed very similar to what we have in the US and Canada and beyond. And in as early as 67, the idea that the housing industry was going to be on par with Japan's car industry was something that was introduced as a concept and a goal. By 1970, interestingly enough, the market share had only reached 7%, which we would still like to reach in the US. And there was an intensification of those efforts, particularly with low interest loans provided by the government to offsite companies. And in 71, as part of that bigger initiative, Sekisui Heim, the first primarily volumetric modular company, was founded, currently the largest company today. The energy crisis decimated the offsite industry. So again, Japan's had its ups and downs as well as we have. From 30 companies, we went down to about 8, which actually are the current players today. In the mid 70s, most of the government programs went away, and light wood frame construction actually came in. By 75, Sekisui Heim began production with its first factory, 7 more to follow. And by 76, actually, one of the industry standards, kind of ceramic facade panel that we'll look at, became widespread. So in the 80s, offsite reached 15%, partly due to long-term efforts, partly due to the increase in performance expectations based on a new seismic code. So offsite was able to achieve those requirements in a way that conventional construction was not. And by 94, as what we will show you today, Sekisui Heim had, after about 20 years, really perfected its product platform and has moved on to other things, particularly consumer experience, but also what we're going to talk about, the circular economy approach. And as recently as 2007, Sekisui Heim has moved offshore and its first facility opened in Thailand. So it's a quick overview. We'll come back to some of those things. Some of the big numbers, Japan has now 15% more or less market share offsite. So it's about 120 housing units a year of total. Of that, most of that is actually provided by 8 players. In fact, most of that is provided by 3 players. 2 panelized companies, Sekisui Heim House and Daiwa House, both constitute for 5% of the total housing market share. Sekisui Heim, who we're going to focus on a little bit more on today, is a volumetric modular company who alone has 2% of market share. So it's comparable in the US to what our entire volumetric permanent PMC industry has currently. And even conventional construction has actually become quite rationalized and industrialized since the 80s. Again, the offsite industry in Japan is primarily focused in single family, and it's primarily light gauge steel, although there are structural steel and light wood frame systems as well. So we're going to jump into Sekisui Chemical. It's a company we've had really good relationship with. We also find, because of the US market, which is heavily volumetric, we found this to be a useful company to look at. Sekisui House and Daiwa are also very interesting models. So what's the secret behind Sekisui Heim's success and survival? Well, it was founded by a chemical company, a plastics company, that was able to support the early R&D and the product platform development throughout the 70s, really, when the company was really getting going. By the 90s, actually, the volumetric modular side of the business has now exceeded the plastic stuff. So that's really interesting, and come back to that. Sekisui Chemical owns 8 factories throughout the archipelago, and any Japanese customer is able to purchase a customized volumetric home and have it delivered within 3 months. We'll talk a little bit more about that. Again, this is just a map showing you the mix. About 80% of the production is in light gauge steel, 20% of it in wood, and about 90% of the production is focused on single family, and 10% on low-rise multifamily rental units. Also, Sekisui Chemical is really subsidiary. It has 2 systems that we'll talk about and 4 related companies. A housing production company, 68% of its budget. A remodeling company, which we'll talk about, that's part of its circular economy, almost 20%. a real estate company that's also, so they're doing their own development, and a residential services company, which is actually related to the multifamily rental units that we'll also see briefly. And the current price mix, which is pretty interesting for us, most 88% is in the mid market, so the equivalent of $200,000 to $400,000 homes. And there's a good bit of the low end and a good bit of the high end. In the future, they hope to decrease that repayment to mid-market for reasons that have to do with the changing market in Japan, and increase the lower end primarily through its lit-light and frame systems. So another thing to keep in mind is that while Sekisui Heim has been developing for 50 years, its main product platform was actually developed in 1968 by an architect through a doctorate at the University of Tokyo, Professor Katsuhiko Ono, who actually happens to be Professor Matsumura's mentor. And it's really this continuous improvement, this gradual growth that is kind of, we think the secret to the success of Sekisui Heim. And this is really something we've been trying to boil down to for the last 5-6 years of looking at Japan. What makes Sekisui Heim's product platform in light gauge steel so successful? Well, interestingly enough, it's a seemingly contradictory combination of a highly standardized set of chassis components that form the structural mod itself, that also support a highly customizable chassis catalog. 60 pre-engineered mod types, which allow, on the one hand, for a highly efficient manufacturing process, on the other hand, for a real feeling and reality of customer customization. So it's also what supports their factories, including the largest factory in Tokyo, which we visited with the group. We can talk about that. We're not going to get into details with this. We're just giving you a quick overview. The chassis themselves, light gauge steel chassis, their assembly in the plant is robotized. This is the most automated part of the process. And here's a quick overview of how the sub-assemblies, which are highly standardized, are formed into a standard mod. And then here's the mod in the Tokyo plant. Again, getting ready for its finishes. Once the mod is moving down the plant, you see a kind of fairly industry-wide standard, which are ceramic and light gauge steel backed panels, facade panels, which are actually made by Sekisui Heim in a proprietary plant for this particular purpose. And then again, a kind of light, almost cabinetry grade infill as much as possible. And here's again a fairly complete mod already rolling down the assembly line. Here's a photo of, again, one of the largest, if not the largest, and certainly one of the most automated volumetric modular plants we've seen in the world. So you can see there's two lines, a load and a high load line. And then you can see the kind of sub-assembly components, some of which are produced in the factory, many of which are produced by subcontractors.
Hey, Ivan, can you go back one slide? Yeah. It's gonna load here. One more, sorry.
Forward.
I just want to show the turntable.
The turntable. Oh, sorry, yes.
There it is.
Yeah, this one.
So I just want to point out to the listeners, I'm not seeing it yet. Just a second.
Sorry.
No, you're
fine.
fine. I interrupted you. I apologize.
No, please.
Anyhow, I'll just describe it. There's a turntable. So when the mods change directions, instead of sort of moving them over with a forklift or some manual process, there are turntables, just like you know, a trolley in San Francisco, where the mods could then move down the next track and keep going. It's pretty fascinating.
I'm just going to go up to, really one of the things that we also wanted to emphasize was, again, the degree to which this is both a production and a sub-assembly plant. So you can see, for example, the ubiquitous bathroom pod on the right. I hope you can see that on the slide. And again, the degree to which even the sub-assembly components, which are ordered often from other manufacturers, the degree of organization and coordination that allows for this all to function. And again, with this system functioning at optimal speeds, and we saw this in person, a mod leaves the factory as frequently as every 3 minutes. And this is not just about speed or efficiency. This has a lot more to do with the customer experience, the ability for someone to walk into a dealership and feel like they're fairly soon going to have a turnkey solution for a single family home. So we've noticed that the automation really helps that customer experience more than anything else. And then once we look at, also just to show you a little bit, Sekisui Heim, through affiliated, again, subcontractors, has a very systematized approach to foundations that are, again, a big issue with getting the mod set to work. Here's just some animations of how their mods come together and some photos from actually a Sekisui Heim video of the same process in person. You can see the cladding here. And really a fascinating thing, Ryan really insisted that the slide was in, and I totally agree with him. One of the interesting details in many Japanese offsite systems, panelized and volumetric, is the use of this one detail, which really comes from the car industry, which is really joints that are finished sort of like weather stripping in your car. And so the same joints that you would see applied in the factory are the same joints that actually really with a mallet very quickly are applied on site. And so again, this is just one slide. I hope everyone sees it, and I hope the slides have caught up, but if they don't, they will. Really, again, as we mentioned, the product platform was, let's say, designed between 68 and 74, really optimized. The factories were optimized between 74 and 94. Much of the equipment that we've seen has actually been in place since the mid-90s, which is pretty impressive. And really, since the mid-90s, the company has really been optimizing the customer experience. And really, it allows for a client who's interested in a custom home, right, that might even go to an architect or a custom builder, is able to walk into a Sekisui Heim dealership, have a meeting often with an architect, who at the one hand is able to provide a kind of a customer experience that is comparable to a design experience that you might have in an architect, but has a kind of proprietary Sekisui Heim software, which can give real data on cost and a fixed date of delivery, which has often been within 30 days of walking into that dealership. So this just gives you a little bit of an understanding of how this has been achieved. We can talk more about that in detail. And again, that's all supported by a very vertically integrated company, one that employs, again, architects, often as salespeople who work with clients to give that customer experience. So sales, there's a sales company, there's a production company, there's a certified group of contractors, builders. And again, and this is something we'll talk about briefly, there is a whole suite of services, both for upgrading your existing homes based on the data that's been collected, as well as on offering new services and new additions, which is interesting, something that was included in the original 1968 product platform, but has only recently become a reality. This is also just, we're not going to talk about this in detail, but 20% of the production is also in lightwood frame, even more similar, very familiar to the kind of construction that we have. The details are a little different. And this wood is actually imported from Sweden or Canada. And here again, even the wood systems, which are slightly less automated, have a high degree of automation included in their fabrication. There's a little bit of but also very skilled in limber labor.
Yeah, just to comment on this, this is a jig, a robotized jig that squares lightwood frame modular construction. This is a big problem we know in modular construction when you do sticks, that in order to get these things true and square so that they stack appropriately on the job site and have tight tolerances is a concern. So they have developed a method to ensure that the box is square before it starts going down the line getting finished.
And just sort of as we're beginning to wrap up, Professor Matsumura has also been really kind over the last few years to explain a unique system of what are called permissions, at least that's the translation, within which modular companies are able to cut some of the red tape that we all experience in the modular industry in the US and even in other countries, where each company is able to bypass some of the permissions that would go through a typical building code review process, and is able to file its own systems, its own product platforms directly with what's called a building center, which allows for certification and optimization of permissions for a project by project basis. So as long as the project follows let's say the specifications of that product platform that was filed, the permitting process, the inspection process is much faster. Japan has made, Japanese offsite manufacturers have banded together to make the argument that most of us in the industry know to be true, but have not yet been able to make it to the public sector, at least in the US, which is that offsite construction is not only potentially more efficient and faster, it is more inspectable. A factory space is not just a safer space to work, it's not just a faster place to work, it's an easier space for an inspector to inspect. And that has been something that's been a big part of the growth and profitability, and also the kind of customer experience, the speed within which delivery happens. And it's interestingly enough, something that Japan has, Japanese experts have told us, is based on looking at, on a number of many other things, the HUD code in the US. And so the fact that the way the trailer homes are inspected, this is somewhat, as differences obviously, this is somewhat the process that Japan has offered all of its offsites, highly finished offsite systems, or panelized systems, or volumetric systems. These are just some high points. We can come back to this slide. It's a really important, and I think it's a next step for, at least for a discussion in the US and Canada, and certainly also in Europe as well. And then just in closing, again, Japan has gotten really good at finding appropriate automation, one that works with also highly skilled labor for its own context. It's gotten really good at serving a consumer that wants a custom home, a high performing custom home, one that actually is only quote unquote 8% more than a spec home. So volumetric, modular, and panelized are seen as a premium product. One where the speed of delivery and the quality warrants actually a markup. That's something clients are willing to pay for. But since in the last 10 or 15 years, due to some issues about sustainability, but also a shrinking market for new construction, Sekisui Heim, but also Sekisui House, the entire kind of ecosystem of modular and panelized companies, has started to look at other sources of revenue through the concept of the circular economy. So in addition to kind of the obvious suite of services that they offer their existing clients to upgrade their existing modules or panels, since Sekisui Heim has data on every screw and every bolt that the customer owns, but have also developed other systems, for example, buyback systems, where if a customer is considering selling their home or even demolishing their home, Sekisui Heim will buy back the house, so that primarily for the light gauge steel modules, and will retrofit them and sell them again. And we were actually fortunate enough during one of our visits to witness a deconstruction of a model home, a standard built modern home. So every month or so, one lucky visitor to one of the Sekisui Heim plants wins one of the model homes. That model home was demounted while we were visiting the factory in 6 hours, and 80% of that construction was reused in the site. So really some of the joints had to be reworked. So this is pretty impressive. And again, not only has Japan shown a way of how we can understand continual improvement and appropriate automation, we can talk about that, what that means in more detail. They're actually really thinking about what we think is, again, another next step. How does offsite construction provide solutions for what we haven't really even addressed yet, which is a much more circular approach to construction. And then I'm gonna let Ryan tell you a little bit about what we've done in the past and what we're planning on doing very soon in the future.
In 2019, we took a group, some I see on this call, to Japan, Ivan and I. These are some of the companies that were represented on that tour. And we call it the Modex network when we go to a local ecology and we visit. And what we do is we visit factories. We also visit job sites and model home village. And then on the last day, we had a symposium where all the major manufacturers from Japan were in the room. And you could ask questions of them. And so it was a back and forth. It was all translated. And we hope to be able to do this again. You can see there were about 100 to 125 people in the room. So 30 or 40 from Modex, and the rest were Japanese folks that wanted to come and meet and network. This is a wonderful opportunity. We hope to be back in 2021 and encourage you all to join us to see these things for yourself. All right. At this point, I think we're going to engage in some questions. And I see there's quite a few on the side. Ivan, I'll field the questions, and then you or I could answer these depending on who we think has the most knowledge in the area. Let's see. Let's start here with multifamily questions. There's quite a few, and we'll go through those. The first is, Japan is super densely populated country. Are there other companies mostly focused on multifamily offsite construction as opposed to single family? Ivan, you want to start on that one?
Yeah. So again, I think the industry originally in the 60s was entirely focused on multifamily, as many countries were, and for reasons that are really interesting based on cost and the advantages of what these companies saw in the offsite space. It's interesting, they moved from affordable housing to really market rate workforce housing. So currently, really all 8 of the big players, they all have some multifamily products, but really the focus is on single family. That has a lot to do with the fact that Japan, like the US, has a cultural preference or even cultural bias towards even low income, middle income, and high income living in single family. So that's really the market. Now, with that said, and I didn't include a slide here, but Sekisui Heim, it's only 10%, but they're producing about 1,000 units a year of mid-rise, well, 3-story multifamily rental units in light gauge steel. And what's fascinating is that system uses exactly the same chassis as the single family product. But again, that segment of their work is growing as the market in general for new construction shrinks. But again, currently all 8 of the players that we've studied, they all offer some offer some multifamily. They're all currently focused on single family. And we asked that of Professor Matsumura, and he sees the potential for growth. Certainly, there's nothing in the product platform that prevents it, but currently it's the market and kind of cultural preferences of consumers across the market spectrum.
That's great. Thank you. I'm going to dismiss some of these questions. If you see your question go away, it's because I think we've answered it, trying to get through the questions. There is a question about connection and details. An engineer wants to know more about the connections and details. And I would just answer that. We'd be happy to provide a few photographs of what we have seen, but certainly I think the best way to see the connections and details, you can go to the Sekisui Heim website and see quite a bit more that they have available in their videos and other resources. And then I encourage you to come on the trip and see it for yourself firsthand. The way it works is there is a hot rolled steel connection at the corner, and then the light gauge steel spandrels and vertical studs. And that's how the pieces are made. You can see in this image, it shows that. And then they secure that as a welded connection between the hot rolled and the light gauge as it comes together. Let's see here. There's a question about earthquake and wind. How tall can this be? Interestingly enough, Ivan can add to this. In the customer experience, one thing that was fascinating is they took us into a, for lack of a better word, Disneyland type customer experience in which we experienced earthquakes and hurricanes while being in a module to show
not just earthquakes, but you could pick which earthquake you wanted to experience. So very culturally rooted fear in a way.
So what they are selling, to answer that question, is they're selling quality and they're selling structural stability. And the tagline of 8% more, isn't that worth it for the safety of your family? It's a real marketing ploy, and they live up to it. And so people are paying a premium for a higher quality home, essentially. It used to be that when the modular industry started in Japan, they did try to sell low cost. That was a strategy. And then that switched, I think in the 80s and 90s, towards a high quality premium product. So the persona of the market shifted and the marketing around it shifted. As far as how tall it can be, I don't know the answer to that question. We did see 3-story volumetric modular, usually using the Sekisui Heim system. I'm not sure about other systems. There's also a question from, what's that, Ivan?
So there also, Japan has all Japanese patents are published in English and Japanese, and we've been studying those. So Sekisui Heim, in addition to having all this great optimized production, is very active in patenting ideas that they have not yet commercialized. And in those patents, we've seen a very similar system for multifamily using the same basic logics with some changes in the gauge of the light gauge steel for up to 6 stories. Again, so this particular, but the application is, has been 2 stories in their single family line and 3 stories, same, more or less same modules in their rental multifamily line.
There was a question about height. You know, the kinds of systems you see from Broad Group in China, or the you know, the precast systems in Singapore, Malaysia, that are building a modular high-rise. That's not really going on in Japan as far as what we can see. This modular solution is for a lower product.
It's going on in highly industrialized, rationalized construction. So we precast, concrete, more conventional systems, but not in the modular space. And again, not because they haven't tried, but it is interesting in the Japanese. Again, it's really the market it's not engineering. It's really the market that has produced this system. The engineering started it as a kind of, this is a result of 30 or 40 years of sales, which is what's so fascinating. This is the reflection of a Japanese market, now, not a global market. But it's really, because again, Japanese construction in all its facets is highly rationalized, highly industrialized, highly optimized. But again, in taller buildings, we've seen, again, much different kinds of approaches to organization, but not a modular approach per se.
Ivan, could you answer the question about standard dimensions of these
Yeah.
volumetric boxes?
Let me go back. I had it hidden. Here we go. So again, the standard dimensions, there's 2 lengths only for, I mean, there are 2 lengths. There's 1.8 and 1.8 and 2, no, sorry, there's 2 widths, 1.3, 2.5. There are 9 lengths ranging from 1.8 meters to as much as 5.4 meters, or for in the US, it's about 25 feet, 24 feet. And then height, and this is clear height, this is in module height, this is floor to ceiling height, is 2.4, 2.6, but Sekisui Heim in its single family line has a pre-engineered solution for providing double height spaces up to 5.2 meters. And actually, not just 5.2 meters, but they have a way, they've engineered a way of clearing also a middle cluster of columns so that they can get a 5.4 by 5 open space as well. So again, and that has to do a lot with what they could have engineered that. A lot of those decisions really came from this iterative, continual improvement, customer input, sort of like our iPhones, more like in the way we often design modular, where it's really what customers were pushing for and what cost they were willing to accept.
Thank you, Ivan. There's a question about now that Sekisui has gone into the UK and developed a relationship with Urban Splash, and you know, the UK government, is this going to have an impact on UK housing? It's a good question. And just to be clear, there are 2 companies that have very similar names. One is Sekisui Heim, the other is Sekisui House. And they did have a previous history, but they broke off long, long ago, decades ago. Sekisui House is more of a development company that globally, so they develop in Australia, they're now developing in the UK, they're developing in the United States, as I understand it. But they have a panelized solution primarily, and you can see here on they are a major player. They primarily have a panelized solution and a kit solution for timber as well. But Sekisui Heim is the volumetric modular company we've been talking about that primarily operates in Japan and now has a factory in Thailand. But they are primarily a manufacturer of modules and project delivery for homes. Sekisui House around the globe is very big. I think it's even bigger than Sekisui Heim as an overall development company, and produces more product and square footage, but it's a panelized solution. Hopefully that helps clear things up.
Sekisui House has a longer history of ventures outside of Japan. So they tried and were not successful at setting up factories in West Germany back in the 80s. They've worked in Australia. They work all over the world. And again, it's interesting because, for example, they have in the single family space, they focus almost entirely on the high end of the market. So they do kit parts houses, almost like high-end Sears Roebuck houses where there's a lot of assembly, but all the components are even higher end. We had a chance to visit their plant and their showrooms, and we'll hopefully do that again. And Sekisui House also has a structural steel in Japan, on the Japan market. I don't think outside of the Japan market, it has a structural steel multifamily rigid frame system, which is also really fascinating. But it's a smaller, while that's 5% of the market share, interestingly enough, none of those systems have the kind of share that Sekisui Heim. So literally, the Sekisui Heim system, Sekisui Chemical, alone, what you just saw is probably 1.75 of the single family market, a single system. That light gauge steel solution you saw is the largest system in terms of market share in Japan. Whereas Sekisui House has a wide variety of systems in Japan.
Ivan, can you answer this next question, Ivan? And there's a couple of them on this, and it relates to your comment about architects acting as both sort of that customized portion of the company. Is this architects working for the company, or is this third-party architects that they contract out to customize projects for customers? Could you explain that process a little more thoroughly?
Yeah, and I think it's important to understand that, this Sekisui Heim is a subsidiary of Sekisui Chemical, which was a plastics company looking at initially through in the 60s and 70s for increasing sales of plastics products. They wanted to make a plastic home. But they went to University of Tokyo, and the system, Sekisui Heim system, was designed from day one by an architect, and that's important. We've been looking at his doctorate. It's quite interesting and quite forward-looking. So the system was designed by an architect, although it's been optimized primarily by mechanical engineers and civil engineers. But the architects that work, and they do work there, from what we understand, they are employees of Sekisui Heim. They like having salespeople in their sales offices, which are architects, because they are able to provide the kind of customer interface, which feels and actually is a bit like the experience of having someone at least work with you on a kid home and provide that flexibility. And that's also where some of that feedback loop. Now, architects did not necessarily design the house, didn't design the system that we see, but the architect dialogue with the client has provided a certain kind of feedback that has led Sekisui onto a road that has tried to combine, on the one hand, a highly standardized product, but one that also doesn't want to turn a client away and says, hey, we can try to do what you want. And that's, again, so it's a unique, they seem to be all, from what we understand, these architects are in-house architects, but the process is, again, this process is much more similar, although different, to the way that our iPhones, the way that our products are not only engineered, but the way that they are continually improved through a mass consumption process, something we have not seen in architecture or in construction to this level and through this length of time. We don't know of an example anywhere in the world.
Ivan, when you answer questions, I have a comment, just if you could be a little closer to your microphone.
All right,
yeah,
sorry, is that better?
That is better, yeah. It just gets a little jumbled, thank you. All right, we're gonna go to another comment, and that is some cultural comments. One is cultural questions. One is, because of Japan seemingly is more comfortable with density and tighter living conditions than, say, Americans are, for example, or even the EU. Is that a factor? And then there's another one related to this, which is a cultural question about Japan's approach to real estate, and that do these homes actually appreciate in value, or do they just depreciate? And if there is a shorter cycle for demolition and reconstruction than, say, here in the United States, to what extent is the success of these companies really just an outgrowth of that cultural factor? So I'll answer the first one, then if you could answer the second one about the demolition and reuse, Ivan. Well, the first one, tighter living conditions, yes, absolutely. In fact, when you go into these model homes and you experience them, they are much smaller living quarters than we are used to. And if you are familiar, and I spent some time in South Korea living there for a few years, and it's not the same culture, but it's more related than, say, the United States. And apartment living is much more common, smaller and tighter quarters, and the space is used for multiple different functions: sleeping, as well as living, and the furniture can be folded up or packed away. And I think that does absolutely add to this factor. But what it also points to is, and we saw this in the Sweden webinar, if you go back to our Sweden webinar as well, a little bit smaller boxes than we're used to in the United States. They manufacture smaller volumetric boxes. Sweden's a little closer to the US than Japan is, but what it points to is that it's demonstrating that you can use smaller boxes to make larger spaces. You can also use smaller boxes to have more flexibility within an overall project.
Plan layout.
And right. And I think that that's key, because one thing we're trying to do in the US, it seems that there is a strategy that has emerged, and Ivan and I don't know if this is the right strategy, but it's get the biggest and largest box you can from the factory, put it on the back of a truck and ship it. And the ultimate model is unit corridor, right? It's a double loaded corridor for hotels and housing. And that seems to become a standard. Whereas when you talk to Japan and you talk to Sweden, what they say is, no, our product platform is the standard, and it can be adapted to many different configurations. We don't standardize the unit hallway. That's not very advantageous because it's not flexible enough. So there's something really interesting there we haven't really teased out yet, but I think that there is something to be said for that. Ivan, do you want to talk about the demolition and the sort of depreciation question?
Yeah, and just a little bit on the density issue too, is that I think Japan is different from, I mean, in general, and we can generalize, Japan is different from the US, although it shares a proclivity towards single family that the US, Australia, and to some degree UK has. Continental Europe is different. Certainly Sweden is different, although people do prefer single family in those markets often as well. But the other thing that's interesting with this density is that it actually is, if we look at not metropolitan regions are growing in the US, this kind of middle landscape between city centers and rural areas, suburbs are getting denser. I know that again, outside of places like Boston, where I live, or Denver, or even places like Phoenix, we're getting a kind of low to mid-rise density that is not so different from the context that Japan has been operating. So I think and again, every place is different, but I do think that there are many conditions where even this is quite similar. But to Ryan's point about the kind of cultural and historic factors, yeah, I mean, there's cultural reasons that Japanese people prefer new construction to existing construction. We're not gonna go into that, but it's interesting that we also have, for other reasons in the US, we have a shorter lifespan, expected lifespan, having to do with resale with the suburban home than actually Japanese people do in terms of cultural reasons. So that's something to think about as well. But even more interestingly, what the Japanese Prefabricated Association has done, actually a second association has done, is that they have lobbied the real estate sector in Japan to assess prefabricated construction as having a different level of depreciation than conventional construction. So offsite homes now, since mid-2000s, actually retain some value. Now, the land retains value in Japan. And so, interestingly enough, a system that, yes, has benefited from the kind of cultural cycles is in fact now staying around longer. And when we look at the circular economy strategy Japan is thinking about, they're clearly seeing, because they have a better understanding of the market than certainly many offsite companies do in the US, simply because of their scale. They're seeing that Japanese consumers, for other reasons, are not moving as quickly, and they're willing to accept upgrades. And so we're starting to see that the lifespans of these buildings are increasing. So again, these things are changing. So yes, there is a history in Japan of this, but the current situation is quite dynamic. And in all of these things, we are asking, as we are asking for folks, I think the value in this knowledge transfer is to use a little bit of abstract thinking. There is no single solution. If we don't start to understand and decouple best practices from context and put them back together, it's gonna be hard to transfer this. There is no solution that's gonna be a tight fit, but really understanding these things in their contexts, understanding these things in terms of a period of change, where they were, where they are, and where they're going, is really key to moving the global and any local industry forward.
Thank you, Ivan. A couple questions here I think I can answer pretty simply. One is, are there Japanese companies focusing on providing modules for use in hybrid systems, or is this a complete system focus? We saw in the panelized solution, solutions or kit solutions from some of the providers, a hybrid of structural types, but that's within one company. So they're still controlling it as one company delivering a housing solution. There's another question, let's see, about finishes. What sort of wall and ceiling finishes do they provide? I assume it isn't drywall with paint is the comment. You're absolutely right. As we all know, that is a bottleneck in US modular manufacturing. And so they are using on the outside, a ceramic tile product. And actually they own a factory, and there are other third-party factories that produce those ceramic tile sheet goods for exterior cladding, and those are put on in the factory as large sheets. As far as interiors, there is a product that is a sheet good, but it's put together with a strip at the joint, and so it's not dissimilar from a cladding panel that you would see on the outside, but as the actual composition of the panel is made up of some cementatious material with a paper siding on the inside. So it does look a little bit odd, I think, to the American eye. It's not your traditional gyp and paint solution, but it's become very common and is culturally accepted in Japan as a durable solution, and it goes in very fast. So that answers that question. Ivan, questions about export, and if we heard anything in our travels about export. Is Sekisui Heim thinking about exporting to different countries this solution? It seems like it would fit in the United States because we're a single family culture that has dominant single family housing. Why haven't they, or what is the story there? Do you know any more?
Yeah, so we had the fortune of touring the factory, one of our visits with a gentleman who set up the Thailand factory, and so gave us some kind of candid insight, some of which we probably shouldn't share, and some of which we can. But in a way, summarizing the Thailand experience, there was both an issue. So the idea, as many of us have, which is the bias that we have in the industry, the idea that we can solve labor issues, but also consumer preference with more technology, was something Sekisui Heim also had. When they went into Thailand, their new plant was actually more automated than even the Japanese plants that were showing. The assumption was that automation would drive the price down to where even high-end Thai consumers could afford what was a middle-class product, and that technology would also account for a lack of highly skilled Japanese trade. So the workers working in this facility are highly skilled, highly motivated, with lots of experience in this facility. It turns out that both of those ideas turned out to be so true. So automation did not replace skilled labor. In fact, the two seem to go hand in hand in the Japanese system. They in fact had to bring Japanese workers to Thailand. That was actually more viable. And then on the other hand, the consumer in Thailand was looking for a very different product and did not seem to value the kinds of performance criteria. The focus was much more on aesthetics. And what they found in the middle class Japanese market, which is the primary consumer, is that consumers want a beautiful customized home, but they're willing, and we saw that when we toured the factories, they're willing to understand. In fact, they're intrigued by the performance, by the seismic performance, by the wind performance, by the circular economy concept, by this approach to quality. And those things did not translate. And I think that experience for Sekisui Heim has made them reconsider export. On the other hand, the fact that the Japanese market is shrinking and there has been shrinking for decades. In fact, these companies have been doing quite well in a shrinking economy for quite a long time. That's important to note. Makes them more interested in exporting than they have, but that experience of Thailand has made them suspicious. Now Sekisui House has made acquisitions in the US, it has made acquisitions in UK. They were more used to this, but even they've been burned. They had an experience in Germany, which we would think would have a compatible material culture. They were not able in the 80s to translate Sekisui House. So this panelized rigid frame manufacturer had similar obstacles. So it's very interesting. Again, we talk about technology, but the cultural factors really are important, which doesn't mean we shouldn't be looking at these systems, but it just means we need to be looking at all of the factors.
Thank you, Ivan. That's great. There's a question here. Let's see if we can answer it. How does the system address variations in context across Japan? So as if you know, Japan has mountainous, snowy regions. It also has very sort of tropical and humid regions. And specific to that question, I don't know what is done with respect to that. If there's higher levels of insulation that can be customized or added, I don't think Ivan and I know the answer to that question, but it's a really good one. What I do know is that energy regulations are seemingly not as strict as we've seen in other countries, and perhaps even less so than in what is being purported in the United States right now. And so that is a concern. And I think an environmental one, a social one, but I don't know any more about that. Ivan, do you have any answers there?
Yeah, I think there's a focus on kind of individual preference, and that really plays out in the variety of mods. I mean, so if we track the development of the system, there's more and more mods, although they're pre-engineered, than there were initially. So but that's more of a really based, the variability is really based on a consumer by consumer more than region by region. What we do know is that, there is a preference for, in some regions, tends to be colder regions for the wood system, and that might be cultural and it might just be performance. But then again, in Hokkaido, which is one of the colder regions, there's primarily steel. They did talk to us about, particularly the wood system tends to have more insulation, I guess, and maybe has less thermal bridging issues. They all have the same cladding system or very similar cladding systems. So there is some variation, but the real focus, again, in Japan has been on, particularly in the main island, has really been on individual preference, and that's where they put their effort. The models do not vary based on regions so much. So there's a model which has a set of parameters, but the mods themselves are incredibly flexible and really change configuration, even though the finishes, actually in a way, the finishes come as a set, there's variation there, but the layouts are quite significantly altered within this kit of parts. And in fact, during these meetings, if clients want to move outside of the 60 pre-engineered mod types, they're able to do that, but the price and time changes. And it's interesting, those custom mods are hand welded in the same facility, and we saw that. So, but pretty much most consumers then move into the kit of parts, into the catalog, which is again really fairly impressively variable, particularly in terms of layout.
There's a question here. With the focus on wood construction portion of the Japanese market, are European hardware CNC machines like Weinmann and Randek and CNC software, CAD/CAM, used in Japan, or is it local? I'll answer that one. Decades ago, Japan developed its own proprietary machines and its own proprietary software to drive those machines. And of course, we all know that they have the wherewithal to do that because of the car manufacturing industry and the ability to make automated tools. Those are proprietary. And in fact, other than their website here that you see, that is one thing that they did want us to not take detailed photos of, was the actual CNC machines that they used to produce the wood and steel solutions. So that
has a lot to do with the kind of local ecology. When we asked them, they not only are they proprietary, they're made by neighboring companies that are providing tool solutions to other companies. So that kind of ecosystem, again, Japan is still a manufacturing ecology. And one other thing though, even 70 to 80% of construction is quote unquote heavy timber conventional. That is also highly CNC-ified. There's that has been a process that's been going on. Those are all also Japanese-made products, and we don't see a single company. There's tool manufacturers in every region that provide services to a whole host of industries. So they're not also tied to any one industry. So it's a different model than we've seen in Europe, which is really dominated by two big manufacturers. And
just to add to that, one thing I would say is, we're very familiar with the Weinmann and Randek systems and also other systems that are out there that may not be as automated. And those solutions tend to be sort of, you can buy this machine and this machine, or you can buy this and this third machine or the fourth machine. And what we've seen in these factories for Japan is very customized proprietary machines for that, designed and built for that specific purpose in those factories. So it's a different approach. There's a question here, why don't we, and I don't know the answer to this question entirely, inclinations, if you have an opinion, Ivan, that'd be great. Why don't we see US home builders investing in modular technology more? So for example, we have large home builders, we have the Pulte's, we have, right? you go down the line, we have these companies. Why are we not seeing more modular construction for single family production building? Any ideas? That's a tough one.
I don't know.
I don't know. What we are seeing, which is fortunate, is a lot of panelized happening now, more and more so. So I think that's a step in the right direction. The other thing I would say is the configuration of our single family houses are not entirely conducive to unit build, to modular volumetric construction. If you look at Sweden, if you look at Japan, one could argue that the design of these homes, even the traditional homes, conventionally built homes, are pretty straightforward. And so if you have a convoluted roof line that we like in America, a very tall gables and hips, that doesn't always work well for a modular solution. So there may be something in there, but we have not unpacked that from a research perspective. I'm speculating. Okay.
One of the big advantages was that the conventional construction. So in Japan, conventional construction is heavy timber, and it still is. 80% of the market, single family, and to some degree overall, is heavy timber construction. So in a strange way, whereas the offsite industry was supported by growth and even a dearth of light gauge steel production. So interestingly enough, the two weren't competing with the same system. So that doesn't answer the question, but it is interesting that, and even the wood systems that offsite manufacturers use are really very familiar to us. They're light wood frame. They're not heavy timber frame. There are some heavy timber kit of parts companies. So at least they're not, the systems are different. And I don't know if that means that those are distinct. And also the conventional builders, which are actually smaller scale, they're much more mom and pop contractors, have also been assisted by a program in the 80s because offsite was taking off so much, and they didn't want to see a kind of network of small businesses disappear and jobs disappear. So that's another reason. But all of the entire ecology in Japan is actually fairly industrialized and fairly automated.
There's a couple of questions here about 3D. If Sekisui Chemical is a chemical company, why aren't they looking at 3D printing their standard chassis? And then there's question, doesn't 3D printing make a lot of sense for construction? Shouldn't we be moving there instead of looking at this modular solution and shipping them internationally? We did not hear anything about 3D printing when we were there that I remember. And I don't see, they may be behind closed doors doing that. We don't know. There is one thing being 3D printed, and it has been for a long time, and that is the cladding panels. Sure,
so
sure.
Cladding panels are 3D printed. There's a ceramic process. It's a ceramic printer. So these are literally, they happen to do this kind of faux brick pattern. They could do other kinds of patterns. You can see and so that is an example. And I think one of the things we suspect though is that once you look at the scale of production and you think about how 3D printers work, there's the size of a 3D printer and the time that it takes to 3D print. When you think about putting a module out every 3 minutes, this kind of assembly process currently is faster and more affordable. So I think the question would be also, Japan, which is a plastics company which certainly uses 3D printing technology, as the question poses, and a volumetric company which has been around for 40 years, why have they not chosen even to use robots in every part of the process? Is something we want to ask, and we would like the audience to think about too. And where do we find appropriate uses of technology, and how do we learn a little bit more from others as opposed to constantly looking to start from scratch, which is definitely something architects, and we're both architects, like to do.
I'm going to close this out and thank Ivan and thank the audience for participating here. And just with this final thought, there are a few questions here that we did not get to that were around the theme of knowledge sharing. And isn't Sekisui Heim concerned that they share this information and it becomes it limits their it limits their ability to take market share and increases competition? And this is something we've learned traveling the globe, that other construction cultures seemingly are more willing to share information. And that knowledge share is important because in order to build an industry, you need data. and you need to share that data to continuously improve the market. So instead of worrying about the fact that one modular manufacturer is competing against another modular manufacturer, a panelized manufacturer is competing against a panelized manufacturer in the United States, rather could we think about it from the perspective of, if we share knowledge, the tide raises all boats. Ultimately, we are not trying to disrupt the modular industry. We're trying to disrupt the traditional construction industry and find a better way to build. And there's a huge pie out there to go get. It's easy for us to say we're academics and researchers and consultants. So we also just applaud all of you who are in the industry trying to make this work, boots on the ground, and we hope to be able to partner with you in doing that. Thanks for joining Modex Japan webinar, and we will be coming back with more webinars and virtual exchanges in the future. Please tune in to modex.network, and we will see you next time. Thank you.
Thank you, guys, and thank you, Ryan.